The document from which this account is drawn was recovered from the sealed inquiry records of the French colonial garrison at Fort Brazzaville, bearing the header Deposition of Lieutenant Jean-Baptiste Marchetti, 14th Frontier Survey Regiment, taken before the Garrison Inquiry Board on the 12th of February, 1765. It was not entered into the public colonial record. The Inquiry Board recorded no findings. What follows is the testimony as given. My name is Jean-Baptiste Marchetti. I hold the rank of lieutenant in the 14th Frontier Survey Regiment and have held that rank for 6 years. I am giving this testimony, not under compulsion, but because I believe it constitutes an accurate account of what occurred in the equatorial interior between the 3rd and 11th of October in the year 1764, and because I am of the opinion that an accurate account must exist somewhere, even if only in sealed military records. I understand this deposition will not be made public. I understand the conclusions of this board are likely to be administrative. I am asking only that what I say here be recorded correctly and completely. I was assigned command of the Survey Patrol in late August of 1764. The orders came from Colonel Aubert, acting on a directive from the trading company holding charter rights to the northern corridor between the Sangha River and the Jesuit mission stations approximately 140 kilometers to the north and east. The directive was clear on its surface. The company wished to know whether a viable overland route existed through the equatorial interior that would reduce transport time for ivory and other goods, as the river route required a wide seasonal detour that the company's barges could not afford. I was given 14 men, 3 Congolese guides employed through the company's intermediary, 22 days of rations, a pack mule for survey equipment, and orders to produce a map if possible, and a written report in any case. Colonel Aubert told me it was a survey mission, and nothing more. I record that now because I want it understood. I went into that interior with no information suggesting it was anything else. The men assigned to my patrol were drawn from 3 companies of the regiment. I will name those who matter to this account and leave the others in the record by rank and duty assignment only. Sergeant Louis Levesque had been in the colonial service for 11 years. He was a practical man, not given to sentiment or to complaint, and he had more experience in the African interior than any other soldier in the patrol, though his prior service had been in the northern savannas rather than in the equatorial basin. He did not believe in most things he could not see, and he said so openly when the occasion arose. I valued his competence above all others in the patrol. I came to disagree with him sharply on the 5th day, and I have thought about that disagreement every day since. Corporal Etienne Arnaud was 32 years old. He had joined the regiment from a farming background in the Loire Valley and carried into his service the physical endurance that comes from years of hard agricultural labor. He was methodical, patient, and reliable in the way that some men are reliable without ever calling attention to the fact. He was the man I trusted for the last watch of the night because I knew he would not sleep through it. I am going to describe what happened to Arnaud in this deposition, and I want the board to know that he deserves to be recorded as he was, a capable man who made a reasonable decision under unreasonable pressure. Private Hugo Dufour was 24 years old. He had come to the regiment after an apprenticeship with a cartographer in Lyon that had not worked out for reasons he did not volunteer and I did not ask about. He had a naturalist's attention to the landscape, a habit of making small observations aloud that more experienced soldiers sometimes found irritating, and a practice of notching the bark of trees with his knife as we moved through dense forest cover. I told him on the first day in the interior that this was unnecessary, given that I was keeping a directional log. He did it anyway. I want it placed in the record clearly. Hugo Dufour's habit of marking trees is the reason 8 of us reached the Sangha River. Private Claude Beaumont was 26. He was not a strong swimmer. I know this because he told me so on the 2nd day, when we crossed a tributary of the Sangha, and he needed a rope on the crossing. I noted it and moved on, and did nothing with the information in the days that followed. I record this in this deposition because accuracy requires recording what I failed to do as clearly as what I did. The 3 Congolese guides were employed through the company and reported through an intermediary I never met directly. The senior guide gave his name to me as Ninga. He spoke adequate French, had worked with colonial survey teams before, and watched the terrain with the consistent, practiced attention of someone who understood that the interior had many ways to kill a man. The other 2 guides I knew as Baya and Tolo. They followed Ndinga's lead in everything. We departed Fort Brazzaville on the 3rd of October, 1764. The transitional season had brought an end to the heavy rains, but the ground remained saturated, and the equatorial heat was compressed and wet in a way that made exertion expensive. The forest we entered on the first day was mature equatorial growth, a continuous canopy of palm species and broadleaf trees that cut the sunlight to a green-filtered dim at the forest floor, with a decomposing organic layer on the ground that muffled footsteps and gave off the particular smell of ancient wet earth slowly returning to itself. I had been in the African interior before, in the northern territories. This was different from those territories in ways I noted immediately. The scale was different. The age was different. The light was different. The equatorial forest in the wet season residue produces an enclosure that the northern savannas do not prepare you for. The sound environment I want to describe in particular, because sound is the thread through which this entire account must be followed. The upper canopy of the equatorial forest in that region was loud in the way that living systems are loud. Birds in continuous layered noise above the 30-meter line, insects in a constant middle register, the occasional crash of something large moving through the high branches. The forest floor, by contrast, was quiet. Footsteps absorbed by the organic layer, streams running without significant sound. The effect was of being in an enormous enclosed space, where the ceiling was loud and the floor was nearly silent. I noted this because the contrast was striking, and because I had not encountered it in the northern territories. I note it now because everything that happened to us afterward was announced by sound, and the specific quality of those sounds is the most important thing I can contribute to this board's understanding. We made good progress on the first 2 days. Ndinga led us north and slightly east along a route that followed low ridges between drainage channels, keeping us off the saturated valley floors while staying on compass bearing toward the mission stations. Levesque took roll each morning and evening. I kept the survey log with measurements taken at intervals. Dufour made his tree notches. Arnaud managed the pack mule and the ration distribution. Beaumont drew rear watch on the march. On the evening of the second day, Ndinga came to where I was writing the survey log and sat across the fire from me in the way that, I had learned from other African guides, indicated something considered and important was about to be said. I waited. He said that we would reach a different kind of country on the 3rd or 4th day, depending on pace. I asked him to describe what he meant. He thought about how to answer, and then said that the forest ahead had water that did not drain, and that things lived in that water. I asked whether he meant crocodiles or hippopotamus, both of which we had been warned to expect. He said no. He said there were things in that water that were not crocodiles, and were not hippopotamus, and that the people whose land adjoined that water did not go into it, and did not go near its edge. He said the name Mokele Mbembe. I wrote it in my survey log. I did not find it alarming. I had encountered a great many local beliefs about dangerous animals and dangerous places in the African interior, and while I respected the practical knowledge of experienced guides regarding terrain and weather and ordinary wildlife, I categorized what Ndinga was describing as regional superstition, of the kind common throughout the continent. I record my assessment at that time as accurately as I can. I was wrong, and the board should know that I was wrong from the beginning. On the 3rd day, the forest changed as Ndinga had predicted. The ridges flattened, the drainage channels widened into standing water covering the forest floor in places to a depth of several centimeters, black and still, and reflecting the filtered light so that the forest floor appeared to be a dark mirror. The trees changed character as well. The lighter palm species and standard broadleaf growth of the first 2 days gave way to older, heavier trees, species I could not identify from the colonial wildlife manuals I had been issued. with wider bases, thicker bark, and a spread of branch that blocked more of the filtered light and produced a deeper dimness at the forest floor. The undergrowth was also denser here, fern-like plants of considerable size growing up from the standing water, some reaching my shoulder. The sound environment changed on the third day. The upper canopy noise diminished. This was not a dramatic or sudden silence, but a reduction, a thinning, as though the canopy were less populated in this zone, or as though its populations had moved away from the area. I noted this in my log. I attributed it to the season, to the transitional period after the rains when populations of birds and insects tend to redistribute. I did not attribute it to anything else. On the fourth day, the canopy was nearly silent. By the afternoon of the fourth day, there was no bird sound at all. At approximately 6 hours into the fourth day's march, and at a distance, I estimated as 42 kilometers from the fort, on a bearing of north-northeast, we came to a stand of broken trees. I want to describe these trees accurately, because their condition was the first thing that required explanation, and because I believe the board should have an accurate record of them. There were 3 trees within a span of approximately 40 meters. They were large trees, old-growth equatorial species, with base diameters in excess of my arm span. Each had been broken at a height of approximately 4 meters from the ground. The upper portions of each tree lay to the side of the standing bases. The breaks were clean, in the way that a living green branch breaks cleanly, rather than the way a long dead dry limb splinters. This indicated the trees had been living at the time of the break, and that the break was relatively recent. There was no evidence of storm damage, no surrounding debris field, no uprooted root systems, no damage to the surrounding canopy consistent with a falling tree of that mass. Something had broken these trees at 4 meters of height. I examined all 3. Levesque examined all 3. Neither of us could identify a cause consistent with any known natural or weather event. I wrote in my survey log, 3 large trees, broken at approximately 4 meters height. Cause unknown. No storm evidence. Ndinga stopped at the broken trees and would not pass them. This was not a slow or uncertain refusal. He stopped walking, turned to face me, and said clearly that we had reached the boundary and that his contract with the trading company did not include passing it. Baya and Tolo stopped immediately behind him. I asked what boundary he meant. He said this was where the land changed and that what lay on the other side was not country that people traveled through. I asked him to be specific. He said that the lagoon was ahead, a large body of water fed by underground springs, and that Mokele Mbembe lived in it, and in the channels that fed it, and that the creature was territorial and did not allow humans to remain near its water. I asked how far ahead the lagoon was. He said half a day of walking. I asked whether the trade route could be mapped without passing the lagoon. He said no. Levesque had heard this exchange. He said quietly, from beside me, that in his experience local guides frequently refused to enter territory for reasons that had more to do with inter-village disputes or tribal boundaries than with actual physical danger, and that he had learned in 11 years of service to assess local refusals on their practical merits, rather than accepting them at face value. I agreed with Levesque's general principle. I want the board to understand that our decision to continue was not reckless by the standards of the information we had at that moment. It was wrong. These are not the same thing, and I ask that the distinction be maintained in whatever conclusions this board reaches. I told Ndinga that his service was concluded, and that he and his 2 colleagues should return to the fort along the route we had come in on. I gave him a letter for Colonel Aubert, explaining that the guides had been released and that the patrol was proceeding into the interior. Ndinga took the letter. Before he left, he said one more thing. I wrote it down that same evening, and I am reciting it from that record now, he said. Do not take anything from near the water, and do not kill anything near the water. If you do nothing near the water, perhaps nothing will happen. Then he left with Baya and Tolo, and we proceeded with 11 soldiers. The forest beyond the broken trees did not look dramatically different from the forest before them. But the silence was now complete. No birds, no insects in the canopy. The standing water on the forest floor was deeper here. reaching the ankle in places, and the fern-like plants were taller. The decomposing floor material gave off a smell I have not encountered anywhere else before or since. Ancient and wet, like earth that has been saturated for longer than the ordinary calculation of time. The pack mule required Arnaud's continuous attention. I want the board to understand the quality of the silence before I describe what replaced it. When I say the forest was silent, I do not mean it was empty. The insects were present on the water, on the leaves, on the bark of the trees. We could see them. They were simply not producing sound. The birds were absent visually, as well as aurally, which was consistent with them having moved away from the zone rather than simply going quiet within it. But the insects were there, and not sounding, and that is a different thing from a place where nothing lives. And the difference is the part I have not been able to explain in any attempt I have made at an explanation. Insects in the equatorial forest do not simply stop. They stopped here. I have been thinking about this for 4 months, and I do not have a satisfying account of it. We reached the lagoon approximately 1 hour before sundown on the 4th day. It was larger than I had expected, from an elevated position on the western shore, where the ground was firmer and slightly higher than the surrounding waterlogged terrain. I estimated the lagoon at approximately 300 meters across at its widest point, extending further than I could clearly see to the north, where it narrowed between the walls of the old-growth canopy. The water was dark, the same deep black of the standing water we had been wading through, but with the stillness of depth rather than the stillness of shallowness. The surface did not move. There was no wind at the surface level. The sky above the lagoon, visible through the open water, was clear and approaching the dark blue of evening. I chose the elevated western shore for camp because it gave sight lines across the water and because the firm ground would take tent stakes. I set a watch rotation, 3 men on 2-hour shifts through the night, with Levesque taking the first watch and Arnaud the last. I instructed all men on watch to record anything they heard or saw, however trivial in appearance, in the watch log. I told the men to keep the cook fire low and to minimize unnecessary sound. I told them this was standard frontier procedure in unfamiliar territory. Several of them nodded with the practiced neutrality of men who have heard this before. No one appeared alarmed. What happened at approximately the 2nd hour of the night is the first thing I want the board to attend to carefully. Levesque woke me. He did not shake me or raise his voice. He crouched beside me, put a hand on my arm, and when I opened my eyes, he said, in a very quiet voice, "You should hear this." I sat up and listened. I am going to describe what I heard as precisely as I can, because this is the central sensory fact of this account, and I believe any future patrol ordered into that interior needs an accurate description of what they will encounter before they encounter it. The sound was low. It was lower than any sound I had previously heard from a living animal. Lower than the deepest drum I had heard at ceremonial gatherings in the northern interior. Lower than close thunder. It occupied a register that was below the range of ordinary hearing, in the sense that I perceived it through the ground beneath me, and through my chest cavity, and through the bones of my hands as much as through my ears. It lasted approximately 30 seconds. In its final 5 seconds it rose slightly in pitch, still very deep, then cut off completely. The silence after it was absolute. I noticed that I had pressed both hands flat against the ground at some point during the listening, without having decided to do so. Levesque told me, quietly, that it had come twice already that night, at intervals of roughly 20 minutes, from across the water. I recorded it in the watch log, approximately 0200 hours. Low vocalization from north. Duration, approximately 30 seconds. Source appears to be across the lagoon. Not identified. The sound came 2 more times during Levesque's watch. It came 3 times during the middle watch. It came twice during Arnaud's final watch before dawn, and he recorded each occurrence with the same brief notation. In the morning, when the full patrol gathered around the cook fire, I asked those who had been off watch whether they had heard anything through the night. Several confirmed they had. Beaumont said the sound had woken him twice, and that he had assumed it was a large animal across the water, and gone back to sleep. Dufour said he had heard it, had remained awake for the rest of his rest period listening, and had noted that there was no other sound between occurrences. He said this last detail in the tone of a man who found it significant. I agreed with him, though I did not say so to the group. No one that morning used the word dangerous. No one said we should leave. I record this because the tendency, looking back at events with knowledge of their outcome, is to attribute more foreknowledge to the participants than they actually had. At breakfast on the morning of the 5th day, the general assessment among the patrol was one of heightened alertness, combined with continued confidence in the mission. We were soldiers on a survey assignment in unfamiliar territory. A large animal across a body of water was unusual, but not, by any previous standard, cause for withdrawal. I want to record precisely what changed that assessment, and when. At approximately 2 hours after sunrise, Dufour called me to the northern edge of the camp elevation. He had been walking the perimeter, as was his habit, and he had found something at the lagoon's edge approximately 40 meters north of the camp position, where a shallow shelf of firmer ground descended toward the water. He had found tracks. I have a field sketch of those tracks, or I had one until my patrol log was taken from me at the fort. I am describing from memory now, but from a clear memory, and I am not reconstructing or embellishing what I saw. The tracks were impressed into the mud of the shelf, in a pattern consistent with a large animal entering or leaving the water. There were 3 of them visible, 2 on the firm mud above the waterline, and 1 partially submerged. Each was roughly circular, with 3 distinct radiating impressions at the forward edge that I assessed as toe marks from a 3-toed foot. I measured the central pad area of each track against my officer's ruler. The diameter was between 60 and 70 centimeters. The depth of the impression in the mud was considerable, indicating substantial weight on each foot. The stride between the 2 tracks on firm ground, measured center to center, was 140 centimeters. Levesque stood beside me. We were both quiet for a time. He said eventually that the only African animal he knew with a 3-toed foot of significant size was the hippopotamus, but that hippopotamus tracks did not look like this. I agreed. He said he was unfamiliar with any animal whose foot size was consistent with what we were looking at. I said I was also unfamiliar with any such animal. Dufour added, without particular emphasis, that there were marks in the mud consistent with a tail drag, a long linear smear beginning approximately 2 meters back from the first track, as though something with a substantial elongated appendage had pulled it across the mud surface while moving toward the water. I made a field sketch of the tracks and the tail drag mark. I recorded the measurements in my patrol log. I want to tell the board what I was thinking at that moment, as honestly as I can. I was not, in that moment, thinking about local superstition or about Indinga's refusal at the broken trees. I was thinking about the sound I had heard through the night, the way it had moved through the earth beneath me, and about the 3 trees broken at 4 meters, and about the 60 to 70 centimeter track in front of me, and I was attempting to construct a logical account that connected these facts. I could not. The only direction the facts pointed was toward an animal of a size that exceeded anything in the colonial wildlife manuals I had been issued, and toward a kind of animal I had no category for. I did not share this conclusion with the patrol. I told them to return to camp, that I had surveyed the tracks, and that we should continue the mission. I told Levesque privately that I wanted an additional man on watch that night, and the cook fire fully extinguished by the 3rd hour of evening. The morning of the 5th day continued without event. Dufour went on a scouting loop to the north and returned to report that the lagoon extended for at least another kilometer in that direction before curving east, and that he had found a second set of tracks on a mud bank, approximately 200 meters north of our position, similar in dimensions to the first. He reported this in the same matter-of-fact tone he reported everything. I noted it and continued the survey log. What I am going to describe now is what happened on the afternoon of the 5th day. At approximately 2 hours before sundown, the pack mule stopped moving. Arnaud had the mule's lead and was approximately 15 meters north of the main camp position when this happened. He reported later that the mule had not been startled by a visible or audible stimulus, but had simply refused to walk, planting its feet and pulling against the lead, and that when Arnaud stepped forward to check the harness, the mule's breathing was fast and shallow, and its eyes were showing white. Arnaud brought the mule back into camp and secured it to a large tree at the camp's edge. The animal positioned itself with its back to the lagoon and its face against the bark and did not settle. Approximately 15 minutes after Arnaud brought the mule in, the sound came. It came in daylight, which it had not done before. It came from across the lagoon, as it had before, but the volume was significantly greater. The quality was the same, deep below the ordinary register of hearing, felt as much through the feet and chest as through the ears, but louder, closer in character, even if the source was the same distance. It lasted approximately 50 seconds, with 2 rises in pitch before dropping, and then silence. Every man in the camp stopped what he was doing. The mule pulled at its lead hard enough that I was concerned it would break the tie. No one spoke for a moment. Then Levesque said, in a voice that was trying to be practical and not quite succeeding, that we should probably move the camp back from the water. I said he was right and began to issue the order. We did not finish it. What I am about to describe is the central event of this account, and I am going to record it with every detail I can accurately supply. At approximately the moment I began to issue the order to move camp, there was a sound from the lagoon that was not the low vocalization. It was a displacement of water, a heavy, sustained disturbance of the lagoon surface that produced wave motion I could see from the camp elevation, concentric ripples moving outward from a point of disturbance in the center of the water and traveling toward the northern bank. I watched this. Several other men watched this. The disturbance reached the northern bank. There was a brief silence. Then there was movement in the trees on the northern bank. I need to give the board an accurate sense of scale. The trees on the northern bank were old-growth equatorial trees. Their canopy was between 25 and 30 meters above the waterline, based on my assessment of comparable trees we had passed through. What I saw moving above the canopy line was a neck. I use that word because it is the most accurate word available. It was long and slightly curved, and it moved in the way a large animal moves its neck when it is examining something, not erratically, but in a slow and controlled arc. I estimated its visible length above the canopy at between 8 and 10 meters, which means the total height of the animal at the top of its visible structure was between 33 and 40 meters. I could not clearly see the head at that distance in the low, late afternoon light. I could see the pale underside of the jaw at the extremity of the neck and the dark mass of the body below the canopy line, largely obscured by the trees, which themselves were 30 meters tall. I opened my field journal. I drew what I saw. I want the board to know that I made this sketch in the moment of the observation, while looking at what I was drawing, with a trained cartographic hand in light that was dim but sufficient for the purpose. The sketch depicted a long neck rising above the canopy line, slightly curved, with an elongated head held horizontally at the top of the curve, and a dark body mass suggested below the canopy. The neck was the color of the dark bark of the old trees, with a lighter coloration on the ventral surface. This is the sketch that was taken from me. The neck was visible for approximately 2 minutes. Then it descended below the canopy line. The trees on the far bank shifted and settled. Silence. And then the ground moved. What I mean by this, a vibration came through the earth beneath our feet, rhythmic, heavy, at a pace consistent with a very large animal walking. It came from the direction of the northern bank, and it was moving south, toward us. Each impact was separated from the next by a pause of approximately 2 to 3 seconds, and each impact was distinct and significant, not a shudder but a clear and measurable pulse transmitted through the ground. Levesque said, "We go, now." I did not argue. I began immediately to organize the withdrawal. And it was here that the disagreement came. Corporal Arnaud said that the supply cache was in the trees 40 meters north of camp. It contained the bulk of our remaining rations, enough for the 3-day return march. Without the cash, 11 men had less than 2 days of food. The return route was a minimum of 3 days. Arnaud said this plainly, not as an argument, but as a statement of arithmetic. He said that he and 2 volunteers could reach the cache, recover what they could carry, and be back within 20 minutes, and that without those rations, the patrol would arrive at the fort in poor condition. He said, "Lieutenant, we can do this. Give me 20 minutes." The vibration in the ground continued. I felt it through the soles of my boots. It had a direction, north of the lagoon, moving south. The cache was north of camp. Levesque said, with unusual force for a man who rarely showed force, "Do not do it." I looked at the northern tree line. I looked at Arnaud. I looked at the 8 other men behind him and calculated what 3 days of march without adequate rations would do to their condition and to the mission. I told Arnaud, 20 minutes. If you are not back in 20 minutes, we cannot wait. Arnaud said, "Understood." He turned to Privates Renaud and Lafont, who had volunteered, and the 3 of them moved north at a jog into the trees. I watched them go. I began moving the remaining soldiers south. I did not see Etienne Arnaud again. I did not see Renaud or Lafont again. At the 20-minute mark, we had covered approximately 600 meters south along the route we had entered on, following Dufour's tree notches. I called a halt. I waited. The forest around us was completely silent. The vocalization had not come again. The ground vibration had not come again since the first minutes of our retreat. I heard nothing from the direction of the cache. Nothing at all. Levesque stood beside me and said nothing. He waited. At the 25-minute mark, I gave the order to continue south. I have reviewed that decision in every waking hour since. The creature had been moving south from the northern bank, south toward the camp, and south toward the cache that sat north of the camp. Sending men north toward where the creature had been moving from was a decision I should not have permitted. I permitted it because Arnaud was correct about the rations, and because he was a capable man who had volunteered with full knowledge. Both of these things are true, and neither of them is sufficient to account for what happened to him. We moved south as quickly as the terrain allowed, which was not fast in the standing water and the dense undergrowth of the low ground. Dufour led, following his notches. I was directly behind him. The pack mule moved now without difficulty, moving quickly, and I noted this. Animals sometimes orient correctly when humans do not. The low vocalization came again at approximately 40 minutes into our south march. It was louder than it had ever been. It came from behind us, from the direction of the camp or close to it. Duration, perhaps 15 seconds. A single long resonant event, and then silence. The silence after it was complete in a way that the silence of the ordinary forest is not complete. Dufour did not stop walking. I did not stop walking. I am going to describe the next 2 hours efficiently, as the board has the essential facts already. We moved south along the notched route for approximately 2 hours, covering perhaps 4 kilometers of difficult ground before the terrain dried and firmed and the ridgeline emerged again beneath our feet. We made a cold camp in the dark, without fire, below the crest of the ridge, with 2-man watch, and the rest directed to sleep. No one slept, which I know because I did not sleep, and could hear from the breathing of the men around me that they could not either. The vocalization came once more during the night, from somewhere behind us and to the north, at a distance I estimated as several kilometers. It came once and did not recur. I lay on the ridge earth and thought about Arnaud and Renaud and Lafont. I thought about what Ndinga had said at the broken trees. Do not take anything from near the water. The supply cache had been near the water. 3 men had gone back to take it. I am not asserting a causal connection. I am recording that the thought occurred to me, and that it has continued to occur to me in the 4 months since, and that I have not found a satisfactory way to dismiss it. We resumed at first light. The route out was faster because Dufour's notches were reliable and because we moved with greater urgency. By midday of the 6th day, we had cleared the worst of the dense interior and reached the savanna margin. I counted the patrol. 7 soldiers and 1 officer. 11 had gone in past the broken trees. 8 came out. The Sangha River crossing was the final difficulty. I want the board to have an accurate account of what happened there, because 2 soldiers died in the crossing, and because I want the circumstances recorded with precision so that they are not summarized as a simple accident. We reached the Sangha ford at which we had crossed on the way in, on the afternoon of the 6th day. It was a manageable crossing in normal conditions, broad and shallow, approximately 70 meters wide, generally no deeper than the chest. We had crossed it without significant difficulty 3 days earlier, though Beaumont had required a rope. I had rope. I organized the crossing. A line strung between 2 trees on either bank, the first man across carrying the far end and securing it, the remainder crossing on the line. The first man was across and the line was secured. Beaumont entered the water 3rd in the crossing rotation. He was moving along the rope, hand over hand, making adequate progress. At mid-channel, the current was stronger than it had been on the way in. The interior rain that follows the transitional season had been running into the Sangha's tributaries, and the main channel was running higher. The footing on the river bottom was uncertain at mid-channel. Beaumont lost his footing. He was holding the rope when he lost his footing, and the current pulled him lateral to it, and the rope ran through his hands before he could grip it, and he went downstream approximately 15 meters before anyone could reach him. Private Moreau went in after him immediately, without order, without hesitation. He was a strong swimmer, and he reached Beaumont within 20 seconds, and Beaumont was not yet in serious distress when Moreau reached him. They were both in the water and making progress toward the far bank when the vocalization came. It came from the forest behind us, from the south margin of the savannah. At a distance, I estimated as 2 to 3 kilometers. It was the longest single occurrence I had heard, sustained for what I assessed as approximately 60 seconds, rising in the middle and falling at the end. And at the peak of it, I felt the ground I was standing on move in the way ground moves when something very large is walking on it, except that we were on a riverbank. The ground at the riverbank moved. I do not know whether what happened next in the water was caused by the vocalization or by the ground movement. I know that the current in the crossing section surged. I know that this surge occurred simultaneously with the peak of the sound. I know that Moreau and Beaumont, who had been moving toward the far bank, were swept further downstream by the surge. I know that I watched Moreau lose contact with Beaumont. We found Moreau on a gravel bar 400 meters downstream that afternoon. We did not find Beaumont. The surviving 6 soldiers and I crossed the Sangha. We reached Fort Brazzaville on the 9th of October, 1764, 6 days after entering the interior past the broken trees. I reported to Colonel Aubert upon arrival. I gave him my survey log and my field sketches. He read the log while I stood before him. He read it completely and slowly, and then he set it on his desk and asked me, without looking up, whether I was claiming that 3 soldiers had been taken by an animal. I said I did not know what had happened to Arnaud, Renaud, and Lafont. He asked whether I was claiming the river crossing had been affected by an unknown animal. I said I was recording the circumstances accurately, and that the correlation between the vocalization and the river surge was in my log. He said I should leave the log with him for the inquiry board, and that I would be called to give testimony in due course. He said that in the meanwhile I was to describe the interior mission as a failed survey due to adverse terrain conditions in any conversation at the fort. I said I understood. I left the log and all field sketches with Colonel Aubert. They were not returned to me. I am now giving this testimony. I have stated what I observed, and what I concluded, and what it cost. 5 men are unaccounted for, from a patrol of 14. I believe the board's most important task is to determine what those 5 men encountered, and what can be done to protect any future patrol from the same encounter. I want to add one final statement before I conclude. In the 4 months since the Sangha crossing, I have had the experience, twice, of feeling a low vibration through the stone floor of my quarters at the fort in the moments before sleep. Both times I lay still and listened. Both times there was nothing audible, only what I felt through the floor. The first time I attributed it to the river. The second time I did not attribute it to anything. Something is in that interior. It is large in a way that exceeds the current vocabulary of natural history, if we restrict natural history to what has been documented. It has a 3-toed foot with a central pad diameter exceeding 60 centimeters. It has a neck of sufficient height to clear a canopy at 30 meters. It has a vocalization so low in register that it is felt through the earth more than heard through the air. It is territorial. It responds to the presence of humans. It responds to what humans remove from its territory. It does not pursue beyond certain limits, but those limits are not where humans expect them to be. The field sketch I made of what I saw above the canopy of the northern bank existed. The measurements in my patrol log existed. I asked this board to locate those materials and enter them into whatever record is made of this inquiry, whatever conclusions are ultimately drawn about their interpretation. That is my deposition. I have nothing further to add except that Corporal Etienne Arnaud, Private Renaud, Private Lafont, Private Claude Beaumont, and Private Moreau were soldiers of the 14th Frontier Survey Regiment, and that they deserve to be named in whatever record is made of this mission. They were capable men. They made reasonable decisions under conditions that were not reasonable. I was their commanding officer. I brought 12 men in and returned with 6. The record should say that clearly.